Oh dear. The visiting fans have taken your measure and they have found you lacking. Worst yet, it might even be the hometown fans. So what do you do to shut them up? You shove a steaming pile of home run down their throats. We've collected the most overrated players in the history of baseball, and we've entered them into our second baseball tournament. Today, we're going over the 6 out of 5s. Welcome back to the Dugs. If you're new to the Dugs, everything we do here is an excuse to tell a lot of baseball stories and a lot of jokes. So if that sounds interesting to you, stay in the know and help us grow by grabbing yourself a free subscription to our channel and liking the video. This is the second of 8 team reveals for our experimental baseball tournaments. If you want a full explanation of the tournament format, you can find that in the first video of our first season of these tournaments, but very briefly, it's a tourney that starts with a group stage featuring 2 groups of 4, followed by a best of 7 playoffs among the final 4 teams that advance. This season's theme is second chances, and that comes in many forms. Today, it comes in the form of proving all the doubters wrong and proving you don't actually belong on this team that you've been assigned to. I imagine it feels exactly like playing for the Baltimore Orioles. So, how do we net out at this list of overrated players? Well, it turns out that Out of the Park Baseball is only our second favorite game of all time, our top selection going to Let's Pass the Blame and Shift Accountability. The players on this team are not reflective of our opinions, which I assure you are perfectly in sync with each and every one of our viewers out there. Rather, we scoured the internet for articles and a few Reddit posts to tally up the players most frequently slapped with the overrated label. Let's begin with the offensive starters, and we'll build from the players with the least amount of consensus to the ones with the highest levels. Starting in left field, it's Kansas City Royals' Alex Gordon. When I think of teams likely to be in the World Series, at no point in my life have I been inclined to answer the Kansas City Royals. And I'd venture to say that Royal fans, ownership, and even the mascot wouldn't put up too much of a fight on that one. Although, I shudder to think of what's going on in that Lions' horribly deformed dome at any given time. So when the Royals appeared in back-to-back World Series in 2014 and 2015, ownership got so excited that they didn't know what to do with their hands. After Gordon hit the game-tying home run in Game 1 of the 2015 World Series, which is the year they went on to win the whole thing, ownership decided to use their hands to thrust a considerable sum of money in Gordon's direction to the tune of 4 years at $72 million. Now, he had some great seasons from 2011 to 2014, but when they put that contract in front of him after the 2015 season, despite that momentous home run, his season wasn't all that convincing due to a groin injury that kept him out for 2 months. However, as unconvincing as it was as high as his WAR would get for the rest of his career. He was only 8 points over the Mendoza line in 2017, leading some to wonder whether the 4-year contract was the worst signing in the club's history. Moving over to second, we have Alfonso Soriano. It's obvious what got Soriano quote-unquote rated. He's got some super flashy numbers. There are exactly 4 players in baseball's 40-40 club, and Soriano is one of them. Jose Canseco was the first member in 1988, which I'm mentioning because he's also one of the 6 out of 5s, but he won't get as much of a feature in this video as he'll be coming off the bench. Now, the 40-40 season is great, but the next season he signed with the Cubs and never again reached even the 20 stolen base mark. He was also consistently one of the worst defensive second basemen in the league. The Cubs moved him out to the outfield, where he developed what the Bleacher Nation describes as that stupid fucking hop when catching fly balls, and after 3 errors in 11 games, he decided to stop the hop. The other big issue was his propensity for striking out and not getting on base. After that 2007 move to the Cubs, he only surpassed an on-base percentage of .333 twice, the first 2 years of his beefy contract. He was also above a 20% strikeout rate every year. So the flashy figures were nice, but like the exhibitionist I saw on the way to work that one time, the flash probably wasn't worth the money after the team crashed through the front of a Walgreens. Back to the outfield, in center, oh man. Look, I need to reiterate that this is just me reporting what the beat writers are saying. In center, it's Bernie Williams. Reading into why Bernie's being burn-smirched, sounds like no one is doubting what he does with the bat. Williams had a streak from 1995 to 2002 where he either surpassed an on-base percentage of .400 or was within 10 points of it. Pair that with 7 seasons, over 20 home runs, a batting title, and 4 championships, I can already feel the hate mail starting to flow in our direction. The beef with his ratedness is his defense, but even that's a hard sell unless you dig deep. He's got 4 gold gloves and had 3 seasons in the top 10 in outfield assists. You dig a little further, however, and stats like total fielding runs above or below average, which generally tracks how many runs a player saved above or below the average outfielder, do not shine so kindly on Bernie. From 96 to 2006, he was rated below average, at times being said to have allowed up to 22 additional runs versus the average fielder, which would have to place him near the bottom of the league. Believe what you will, the Ducks is here to let the man vindicate himself. You're welcome, New York. Let's balance the scales a bit and throw the Yankees a bone here. Starting behind home plate, we have Boston's Jason Varitek. The argument against Varitek is the same argument I've frequently heard used against me. He's a stand-up guy, the moral center, tremendously good-looking, and the core without which all the talent around him would fall apart. Since Boston is such a storied franchise, a guy like that is going to be given a whole lot of chutzpah. Beneath the chutzpah, however, is a somewhat mediocre player. He's a career .256 hitter, and defensively, it was all a little embarrassing sometimes. He had 4 years in the top 10 for errors by a catcher and couldn't catch a base stealer if his life depended on it. For 7 seasons, he was in the top 10 for stolen bases allowed, leading the pack on 3 different occasions, and it wasn't particularly close. 124 bases were stolen against him in 1999. The next closest, Darren Fletcher at 79. The following year, he once again led the pack by 29. 99 also saw him blowing away the competition in passed balls as well. But he did shove Alex Rodriguez in the face. And that kind of thing is going to bring up your stock in Beantown, even if catcher is an overly generous description of what you're doing on the field. At the hot corner, we've got Ken Caminiti. You'd think it'd be odd for a hitter to hit his absolute peak at the age of 33, and you would be absolutely right. Caminiti pumped himself so full of steroids in his 1996 MVP campaign that his Johnson likely looked like someone had stapled a couple of grape nuts to a kielbasa. The arguments for Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds that are gaining in popularity is that they very clearly would have been elite even without the steroids. No one's making the same argument for Kenny. He was average at best prior to 96 and then started hitting the juice to a tune of 40 home runs and a slash of .326, .408, .621. It swiftly fell apart afterwards as the injuries began to pile up, as did the substance abuse, which would be the thing that would kill him in 2004 at the young age of 41. Back into the outfield, we're now starting to turn the clock back a bit as we bring in Harold Baines. The beef on Baines is that his defense was so bad that they moved him to the DH. And for a DH, he wasn't necessarily anything special. Not being special is going to be an issue when you've been enshrined in the Hall of Fame. So it's no wonder why he's considered overrated. He never cracked 30 home runs and only cracked the top 10 in home runs during one season. You gotta give it to the guy for longevity though. He was in the league for 21 years and had over 11,000 plate appearances, so teams were clearly happy to have him on his team. He's the kind of guy you can bring home to mom, but mom's gonna be complaining that he's not a doctor and that he needs to hit more home runs. Next up, and tied for tops in overrated votes on the offensive side of the ball, it's Joe Carter. The ability the World Series has to make legends is on full display with Joe. People are inclined to glaze over what you've done with the rest of your career when you've got this moment to top your resume.
Here's a pitch on the way, a swing and a belt, left field, way back, Blue Jays win it! The Blue Jays are World Series champions as Joe Carter hits a 3-run home run in the 9th inning, and the Blue Jays have repeated as World Series champions. Touch 'em all, Joe. You'll never hit a bigger home run in your life.
It's only the second time in history that the World Series ended on a home run, the other one being hit by Bill Mazeroski, who's also on this team, but coming off the bench, and the only time in history that the championship-clinching dinger was hit by a team that was currently trailing in the bottom of the 9th. Outside of those heroics, however, Joe translated to a good power hitter, but not a lot else. He was a career .259 hitter, got on base just a smidge over 30% of the time, and was a below-average defender. Don't say those things in Toronto, though. Drake's gonna get ya. In fact, Drake used an image of Joe rounding the bases on his famous home run as the image for his single back-to-back. Lastly, also at 6 votes, it's Phil Rizzuto at shortstop. The book on Rizzuto is that he had one phenomenal season. He absolutely crushed it in 1950 with an on-base percentage over .400, winning the MVP. Outside of that, he was decent. He was absolutely an elite defender, and for 4 straight years, he led the league in sacrifice bunts. But arguing that you belong in the Hall of Fame because you're a good bunter is a lot like asking a woman to marry you because you can drive stick. He's not all that different from Omar Vizquel in that anytime I have to talk about Omar Vizquel, I feel like I immediately need a shot of espresso afterwards. However, being a part of several elite Yankees teams that featured the likes of Whitey Ford, Joe DiMaggio, and Mickey Mantle tends to inflate your profile a bit, and it's their shoulders that may have carried him into the Hall. On the bench, we've got Bill Mazeroski and Jose Canseco, who we've mentioned a little bit already. We also have another 6-vote getter in Roger Maris. He's an extremely familiar name, but that may be in part due to Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire more than anything else. Before Barry happened, Sosa and McGwire engaged in a home run race in 1998, the likes of which the league had never seen before, and Major League Baseball could not be happier. The league still had a bit of a black eye from the 94-95 strike, as if you look at the attendance figures in 1995, which was the first year after the strike, numbers went down 20% from 1994. Many consider the home run race as the event that brought people back to the sport, as both Sosa and McGwire looked to both be on the pace to beat the previous season record of 61 home runs. The owner of those 61 home runs was Roger Maris during the 1961 season. It seemingly came out of nowhere, as he had never even cracked 40 previously in his career. In fact, the rest of his career kind of pales in comparison to his peak 3 years of 1960 to 62, where he took down the MVP twice. Outside of those 3 years, his WAR peaked at 3.4 in 1964, which is the only year he exceeded 3 outside of that 3-year run. But 1998 was all about Sosa and McGwire, and you couldn't talk about either of them without talking about Maris. Rounding out the bench, you have Paul Konerko, who was a 6-time All-Star despite only cracking 4 WAR twice. But he's another guy that rode a single postseason success to lofty and potentially undeserving heights. And lastly, we have Ray Schalk. It's been over 100 years since he's been on the baseball diamond, but somehow writers still have a big enough hard-on to bring him up in the context of being overrated. If he hadn't made the Hall of Fame, maybe no one calls him overrated, but since he has, people are going to make fun of you for your career slugging percentage of .316. Honorable mention goes to the man that we opened the video with, as several of these sources mentioned Bryce Harper. Those articles were written before his most recent MVP win, so I'm inclined to step in and give him a pass. Onward to the pitching. The starting rotation is extremely polarized. For 4 out of the 5 in the rotation, there's not much consensus, but the 5th pitcher is the most universally overrated player on the team. Let's start with the players that people complain about the least. Boston made a huge investment in David Price in 2016, as his contract has had him slated to be making at least $30 million per year since that year. He'll be making that again in 2022. Naturally, Boston wanted to make use of that investment and threw him out there for 230 innings in that initial year, facing an MLB leading 951 batters. And he was decent, but not $30 million decent. The workload may not have been the most wicked smart thing they could have done, as that appeared to break him. He tweaked his arm in spring training the next year, and doctors told him, nah, you're fine. But he wasn't, and he only threw 74 innings. He was decent in 2018, fell off further in 2019 and pitched only 107 innings due to injuries, and opted out of the 2020 COVID season. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that decision, and his pay was adjusted accordingly, but it's a tough pill to swallow when you know your big investment is going to be 35 the next time he appears on the mound. Boston shipped him to the Dodgers in 2021 so they could get by with splitting the remainder of what he's owed on his contract. So, it's probably safe to say,
the price is wrong, bitch.
Next up, we have Gaylord Perry. And yeah, I just don't know about calling this guy overrated. Once again, it's a Hall of Famer, which seems to be a crucial ingredient to being overly scrutinized. And yes, the argument against him is also a common one in that he wasn't necessarily top-notch, but rather he was just around for an extraordinarily long stretch of time. To demonstrate just how long he was around, here's his baseball card from the first year of his career in 1962, and here's his card from the final year in the league in 1983. I would have guessed he was an equipment manager, maybe a first base coach. You can't see it, but you know this guy has a forest of salt and pepper hair growing out of his ears, that he groans every time he has to pick something up off the ground, and his locker just reeks of icy hot. But yeah, I don't know. He managed to pitch that long and still rack up an ERA in the low 3s and 2 Cy Youngs. Now, it wasn't all roses and Ben Gay, but surely those accomplishments bring how overrated he was into question. Third man in the rotation is Fernando Valenzuela. When you've got a mania or Linsanity named after you, the conditions are ripe for some overratedness. The thing is, Fernando Mania was entirely justified, and I don't think anybody's going to argue that. In his rookie year, he won both Rookie of the Year and the Cy Young, which is still the only time that that's ever happened. He was absolutely elite from 1981 to 1986, but the issue is that he didn't retire until after the 1997 season. The good seasons were few and far between for the final 11 years of his career, but folks tend to forget that, and more remember the Mania and the 1990 no-hitter. Dave Stewart is the last of the two vote getters before we move on to the most overrated player on the entire team. And just eyeballing Dave's stats? Yeah, makes sense. His career ERA sits at about 4, but people are likely more inclined to remember a handful of elite seasons and his postseason heroics. He's got 3 rings to his name and was the World Series MVP in 1989 with Oakland. Collectively, his postseason ERA is south of 3, so when he had all the eyeballs on him, he put on a show. But the show was less consistent than a Broadway production and more like a flash mob. Okay, the big one's here. An overwhelming 8 different sources called this pitcher overrated. And I've got to say, I was surprised. This is one of those guys I grew up hearing all of the legendary tales about, so it took me entirely by surprise to see him so universally criticized. That pitcher? Nolan Ryan. I have no idea what this guy's arm is made out of. Armchair head coaches love criticizing management's decision to overuse their starting pitchers, but what in the hell do you say about this guy? He entered the league in 1966 and didn't leave until 1993. He's pitched well over 5,300 innings in his career. He's exceeded 300 innings pitched twice and was an inning away from making it 3 times. Now, this kind of workload wasn't all that uncommon in the dead ball era, but Nolan Ryan is not a dead ball era pitcher. I could accept someone like Jamie Moyer hitting these workhorse numbers because he lets go of the ball and asks it politely to make its way to the plate at a time convenient to it, but Nolan Ryan sits atop the all-time leaderboards in strikeouts at 5,714, a record I fully expect to outlive me, and let me tell you, my diet is actually fairly solid. No one is a more cautious pedestrian than me. He topped out at nearly 101 miles per hour on his fastball, which is either the kind of guy you see with a shorter career, or everyone pivots to calling a crafty veteran after they start relying on the off-speed stuff in their later days, like a gosh darn sissy. So how could this guy possibly be overrated? Well, he was wild. He's also the all-time leader in walks, and that's not just due to his longevity. He led the league in walks during 8 different seasons, wild pitches in 6 different seasons, and in 11 out of his 27 seasons pitching, his personal winning percentage was lower than the team he was representing that year. These reasons likely have a lot to do with him not taking down a single Cy Young in his career, and the only World Series ring on his hand came from the 1969 New York Mets when he was coming out of the pen as a wee 22-year-old, contributing 2 1/3 innings to the effort. Moving out of the bullpen, it's Don Drysdale, who people tend to say benefited a bit too much by the bright halo that his amazing supporting cast to the Dodgers provided. Barry Zito, who signed a huge deal with the Giants, but then the team seemed to succeed in spite of him rather than because of him. Catfish Hunter, who had some dominant seasons but lacked the consistency. Early Win and Phil Niekro, who both earned 300 wins, but wins suck as a metric and it took them a couple decades to hit that mark. Lee Smith, who is suffering from all closers are overrated syndrome. And rounding out the pen, you've got Jack Morris, who is second to Nolan Ryan for the pitcher with the most grievances. He's got some of the weaker numbers you'll find on this team, but he also seems to have a fan club campaigning for him every time the Hall of Fame vote comes around. It's a formidable squad with a lot to prove. Let's put them on the board. We'll be back tomorrow with the reveal of the next team. Once again, if you enjoyed this, consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video to spread the good word of the Ducks. Have some opinions on who else should have been included on the overrated squad? Let us know in the comments. Until tomorrow then, I've been Johnny Paprika, hoping all of your balls are fair and all of your wood is good. Good night, everybody!